All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming and joining our webinar. This is a new technology that HWE is starting to use a little bit more. We're going to give it a minute or two for everybody to log on. The response to this has been great, but we'll probably start at, call it 10:33, so give it about 2 more minutes. All right. Well, in respect to the time, we're going to get started here, and I see continuing to get people to join. Thank you very much, Adam, for joining me, and for the unseen audience out there. We thank you for joining this somewhat new technology. As I mentioned, using a webinar through Zoom is great. It's one of the silver linings of what's come out of this pandemic. And I'm really excited about spending some time talking to Adam Pittenger today about the data that he has collaborated with us on. I want to introduce him. Adam is the founder and CEO of Moved.com. And Moved.com really is a company that automates using software the resident onboarding process, and it's a great software. I'm sure Adam could tell you more about it. A good friend of ours, a mutual friend, Kunal Chothani, connected us, and knowing that HWE is a very data-driven company, we try to talk about the market, analyze the market, and market properties using data. I was thrilled to meet Adam because his company has really interesting insights, which we're going to spend some time today talking about. Adam, can you tell us a little bit about just Move.com and the company that you've started, just for our audience's benefit?
Absolutely, yeah. And Daniel, the How Does the Word Elliott team, appreciate you putting this together today. I'm excited to be a part of it. So yeah, as Daniel mentioned, I'm Adam Pittenger, the founder and CEO of Moved. You can check us out at Moved.com. We launched about almost 5 years ago, helping people navigate the very stressful process of moving, and have extended our services into property management and storage, helping them automate the process of onboarding new residents. And as part of that, given the amount of customers we get coming directly to us to help with their moves, but also the customers that we see through our property management partners, through our storage partners, we have a pretty unique lens on the movement happening. Our primary market, the market we started in, was New York City. We've since expanded to most major metros across the country. But because we're not an individual moving company, but rather a network of moving companies, and we have a plethora of those partners, we do have a pretty significant data set to look at, trends in the moving industry, where people are going, what types of moves they're having, and I think that's some of the stuff we'll start digging into today.
Awesome. Really, again, thanks for joining us and thanks for the collaboration. I think hopefully it'll be interesting to everybody. You know, I think the genesis of this collaboration really came as we were in the heart of the pandemic. I think a lot of people saw headlines everywhere that really kind of talked about the fact that there was a real trend towards people moving. There was, you know, headlines saying that moving companies were turning people away because they were so busy. And, you know, many of us during the pandemic, meaning within the audience, everybody knows somebody that moved or left the city. And I think that it occurred to me during that time that the moving companies really had kind of an extra amount of insight into what was going on, and that maybe there was more to the story than what was being reported in the press. And it's always interesting to compare what the data really tells us and what the press is telling us, and see how much more insight we can get from analyzing the data ourselves. And so, Adam, I imagine the last few months with everything going on have been great for business for a moving company. What's it been like?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I think, you know, as with everyone, came into this year thinking this was going to be a normal year and we're going to have our typical moving cycle. As you know, things really started to come to light in March. I think, like everyone, we weren't sure what was next, and we're sort of bracing for the worst. And the initial reaction we saw was kind of a halt in movement, and that's what we saw sort of towards the end of Q1 and beginning of Q2. And we were just thankful that moving was deemed essential, and we were exempt from a lot of the restrictions that you were seeing for businesses across the city. And so, you know, April was kind of a sleepy month, but towards the end of it and then heading into May, things started to pick up, and we sort of were guessing, okay, you know, maybe some of those moves that didn't happen in March and April were starting to happen now. But then June made May look like child's play, and it really didn't let up during the summer. So yeah, we've been incredibly busy, notably seeing a lot through our storage partners. I know I passively mentioned this to you, Daniel, but we actually pulled all of our marketing spend. We didn't have to do any marketing this summer because the demand was so high. And a lot of the moving partners, because we're a network of moving companies, we have pretty unique insight into the capacity of each moving company. Within our platform, they're keeping their, you know, the amount of trucks they have available, the amount of crews they have available, and the speed at which these companies were selling out was something we'd never seen before. So, you know, I think there's a lot of factors for that we'll start diving into, but headline is correct that the moving has been incredibly busy this summer.
Interesting. So this is really what intrigued me as we started to collaborate. And I think, you know, what we started is that your business is national in scope, but a big chunk of your business is in New York City. So a lot of the moves that you're coordinating were in New York City during the pandemic. And I sort of said initially, I said, you know, let's group these moves into three buckets. People moving from New York City within the city, so NYC to NYC. The next bucket would be NYC to the tri-state area. So they're leaving the city, but they're going nearby to New York, Connecticut, New Jersey. And then the third bucket would be New York City to out of state. Just they're leaving completely beyond the tri-state area. And the next slide which is going to get into the data, is sort of what came of that exercise. So Adam, maybe you can tell us what your findings were when we started that exercise.
Yeah, I think if you're perusing news outlets and you're looking at aggregators and looking at headlines there, this slide might come as a surprise, because I think we've all been hearing about the mass exodus from New York City. And, you know, as moving volume started to pick up, as I was saying, no doubt we saw people leaving New York, you know, but you see people leaving New York every year. It looks like, you know, about 9% were moving to tri-state or out of tri-state, moving out of New York City altogether. But a bucket that you obviously see predominantly displayed here, you're not going to read about because it's not a very sexy headline to read about, is a lot of people moving their things to storage. And again, we have a lot of storage partners. We partner with Manhattan Mini Storage, Life Storage, Extra Space Storage. So we see this across different storage portfolios in New York and beyond. A large amount of people were moving their things into storage. So, of the two buckets, one, hey, I'm moving out of state, I'm moving to Florida, I'm moving wherever. Again, that happens, but that happens all the time. We saw an unprecedented spike in storage moves, people moving their things from their New York City apartment into storage. And sort of the main takeaway we've seen from that is as COVID was hitting the city, a lot of people were leaving. And, I'm going to go stay with family here. I'm going to go to, California, the suburbs, wherever. And as we know, a lot, lease cycles tend to, a lot of leases are ending in the summer. Really, if you're not living in your Manhattan apartment, that just becomes a very expensive storage unit. And so given the uncertainty, we're in October and the uncertainty that we have now is still quite high. But the uncertainty in June, July, August was, you don't really know what's going to happen next, notably in New York City. So getting a lease renewal contract at that time isn't really attractive, and having a really expensive storage unit isn't really attractive. So we saw a lot of people deciding, okay, I'm not going to renew, but I am going to put my things into a storage unit. And so I think the data reflects the really high number of folks that we see put their things into storage. And I think as we'll get into kind of where the storage units lie and what's next, but this isn't something that you're going to read in a headline somewhere.
Really interesting. So this is like you said, a pretty big surprise. I think it was counterintuitive to many. I think one question that I had, as well as others, so this pie chart covers what period of time? We're talking, is this recent data? This is during the pandemic, largely?
Yeah, we pulled this through September, so January through September.
Okay, so it had a few moves pre-COVID, but the vast majority of this data falls during the pandemic. And what does this chart look like during a normal year? In terms of storage, has storage moves jumped quite a bit? Have out-of-state moves? How does this look in a normal year pre-COVID?
Yeah, and I do see some questions coming in that regard. So to give some context, moving overall has grown. And so, again, I mentioned the lack of our doing any outreach or any marketing. And even still, we saw moves over that same time period grow over 50% in New York City. Really strong. But I think even more important is the storage bucket that we're talking about. And that grew about just shy of 81% year over year.
Wow.
Compared to what we saw for storage moves in 2019. What I think is, diving a little bit deeper into how the composition breaks down, right? In 2019, it was about a third of the moves that we were seeing locally within New York City. And then in 2020, over the same time period, about 42% local moves in New York City that we were seeing were going into storage. So not only a huge spike generally, because you're also seeing a huge spike in moving, but the composition of the amount of moves from a storage perspective was higher. So that type of move has really grown much faster than just moving in general.
Really interesting. So we're seeing a lot of questions come in, some of which we will answer later as we kind of dive into some other slides as it relates to the demographics. We don't have perfect insight into every demographic of every mover, but we have some things that give us some more information. So we'll hit those a little bit later. Adam, is there any way you can give people a sense? I know how big of a data set are we dealing with here?
So we don't publicly disclose our numbers, but I will say that this is in the tens of thousands of moves.
Okay, so this is not just a few hundred people that we're slicing up here. Like, this is many thousands of moves that have occurred during the summer, specifically in New York City. So this is a pretty interesting slide that so many people have moved into storage and seemingly made what was an economic decision. And I liked how you put it, that they were moving from their apartment, which effectively became like a storage unit for their stuff while they moved somewhere else during the pandemic. But they made the temporary economic decision to just take their stuff and move into storage. What do we know about that consumer behavior? I mean, how long do they keep their things in storage? Do we have any insight as to why where they choose the location they put their stuff in storage and things like that? What does it tell us about people?
Yeah, absolutely. And just quickly going back to the sort of data set here, because I did see a question around, is this a survey of 500, 1,000? Again, it's a pretty significant chunk of the moving volume, but more importantly, this is not a survey. These are verified customers. They are booking through us. They are paying through us. The moving companies are dispatched through our software. So we know these moves actually happened, and they're not just some survey saying, oh yeah, I moved my things into storage. Now to the question around the location of storage, I think that's why this is such an interesting statistic, because people store their things where they intend to be. Is the kind of the headline there. So as an example, if I'm moving from New York to LA and I need to store my things temporarily, I'm going to move my things. I'm not going to store my things in New York and then move them to LA. You move them to LA, you store them locally in LA, and then you hire a local crew. That's how moving companies work. That's how consumer behavior works as well. But more importantly, and I think we'll get into this, Daniel, around where these storage units are, I will call out now as sort of a teaser for that. Manhattan has the most expensive storage units. Manhattan Mini Storage, who's a partner of ours, 17 facilities, all within Manhattan. They really dominate the market, and their prices are high. And their prices in this year are much higher as their occupancy has continued to grow. So the fact that people are keeping these things, not only in New York City, but keeping these things in Manhattan and paying higher prices to do that is a very positive indicator that they intend to come back. Now, whether them coming back stays within Manhattan, maybe they go to Brooklyn, Queens, etc. I think we'll find that out in the coming months. But the location of the storage being in New York is a very strong indicator that they intend to come back.
That's interesting. Well, that's a good segue to the next slide. So I've put it back up. And this is the location of the storage unit. So, wow, 90% of people put their things into storage. So when you looked at that pie in the last chart, 62% right here went into storage. Of those that went into storage, 90% were in Manhattan. So you've seen consumer behavior that typically people put their things into storage close to where they intend to come back. So this makes sense. I mean, we've seen a rise in vacancy in Manhattan. We've seen, obviously, the city is not operating at full capacity, but it would appear that people have, in their consumer behavior, putting things into storage, have seemed to show an interest in coming back to the city at some point. What else can we learn from the fact that 90% of people put it into storage in Manhattan specifically?
Yeah, I think, again, the prices being higher there is, you're not going to pay a higher price if you don't have to, right? If there's not a reason behind that. And I did see, I'm going to try to answer as many questions as we can, live while we're going through it. But, somebody's asking about, if MMS is at 100% capacity, what happens, right? And I think we're starting to see that. We're starting to see Brooklyn storage units and Queens storage units start to fill up, because people want to keep their things locally if they intend to come back, right? If I intend to move to Miami, I'm not going to keep my things in storage in New York City. and then eventually move them to Miami. I'm gonna move them out of there. So I think people keeping them locally is, again, a sign that they come back. Now, when that happens, I think there's a lot of still uncertainty around the virus, around businesses opening, around people getting back to work, that we still don't have any clarity around. So when that happens, we'll see. But for now, their things are parked there, and eventually those will move into apartments.
Interesting. Now, I want to show what your data is showing ties really well to a totally separate data set, which is a friend of mine who covers the public REITs, including the storage REITs, shared with me. This data comes from Jefferies and some of their partners, and effectively what it's showing is the net effective publicly available rents for storage units year-over-year growth. And what you mentioned, Adam, that you saw kind of when the pandemic started, there were very few people that knew exactly what they were going to do. So that was March, April, maybe into May. There weren't a lot of moves happening. And you saw that in the storage data, that pricing power really dropped, and a lot of the storage companies kind of panicked and dropped their prices because demand was so low. But then you can see in the data that pricing starts to rise again mid-May, and really since then has just continued to climb. And somebody has shared, I don't know that I've verified this, but that Manhattan mini storage is at nearly 100% capacity. Somebody commented that. I think that this is kind of a real interesting trend, that these storage companies have just had an unprecedented amount of demand. And in many ways, I find this is like an encouraging amount of insight, because it would suggest that people didn't leave permanently. I mean, we go back to some of our other slides. The headlines led us to believe that everybody was leaving out of state, but that was more of where they went to leave. But where did they put their belongings? And it seems that they left their belongings in New York City and intend to come back. We just don't know exactly when, but it is showing intention to come back, which is great.
Yeah, and I would say the data and the anecdotes they're going to get from speaking to moving companies, because I've seen some headlines around that. Oh, the moving company is turning people away, they're charging all these high prices, et cetera, is only going to add fire to the people are leaving, sort of narrative that's being spun. But drilling into where those things will go, I think is really the more important context to have here. It's funny, when you showed me this slide, I said this literally mirrors our New York City moves slide for our company, right? We saw in April it kind of go off a cliff, and then not just for moves generally it rising, but the storage moves was effectively a V. It went from very little, and you see the storage companies are saying, hey, we need to attract people, we have to have really aggressive and attractive pricing. Those going down in May, and then as soon as people started moving in May and occupancy went up, supply and demand. I mean, the storage companies, look at public storage's pricing. That's crazy. I'm sure that's to a level they never even imagined they'd be at. So, that's exactly what we've seen in our data. I think this further backs it up. And again, I think there's a lot of people's stuff in storage right now that doesn't yet have a final destination. Interesting.
Somebody asked, just to clarify, and we anticipated this because a lot of people want to really know what data they're looking at. This chart, Adam, it represents moves within all of New York City or just Manhattan?
These are moves within New York City.
Okay, so this is all of the moves that you coordinated throughout New York City, all 5 boroughs, probably more like 4. We don't really count Staten Island in any of our charts. Okay, so that just answers that question. Now, I want to go back to this chart. So we're looking at the same chart we were at the beginning, but we've highlighted a different portion of it. So shifting gears here these are the people, 29% of the moves that happened this summer and through October as well, were New York City They lived in New York City, they were coordinating a move, and they were moving to somewhere else in New York City. So they stayed. They were not putting their stuff into storage. They were not moving out of state. These were the people, 1 out of 3 stayed in New York City in your data set. So what can we learn from this? I mean, do we have insights into the demographics here? And maybe we can jump into the next slide. So to kind of answer the question, what do we learn from this slide here?
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can take from this slide. So again, these are true residential moves happening, you know, a typical local move that you might expect happening within New York City in the same time frame. So you obviously have a lot of people moving things to storage. You have a segment of people that are moving their things out of the area, out of the city in general. And then you do have a good chunk of people that are staying. And again, you know, to the question of what does NYC mean here? It does mean all of the boroughs. And we've really seen Brooklyn dominate and grow a lot. I think there's probably a few reasons that we can deduce from that, looking at some of the demographic data that we have, and notably around move size, which is bedroom size, basically. We're seeing a lot of young professionals go to Brooklyn and Queens from Manhattan because Manhattan, whether it's a narrative or not, has really been kind of labeled ground zero for COVID-19. And so if those folks didn't have a place to go out of state, across the country, a second home, a parent's home, whatever it is, but potentially wanted more space, wanted to stay close to the city to see, you know, when am I going to have to go back to work? How do I stay close to friends and their family? Brooklyn, I think, represents a really interesting, place for that, a really interesting location, which we were seeing grow regardless. But potentially this pandemic has only accelerated that movement. And I think we see that here in the data. Very
interesting. I mean, I think that, pre-COVID, Brooklyn had firmly established itself as, like I say, the epitome of cool. It was a global brand. They have, the French say, Trey Brooklyn is like this, way of saying it's cool, and so I think that the idea here is that Brooklyn very much had come into its own pre-COVID, but as a result of that, it really benefited from a lot of people who were looking for more space. They wanted to get out of Manhattan, which, maybe was perceived at that time to be kind of the epicenter of it all. And Brooklyn felt like, a place they could go for maybe a little more calm and peace. There wasn't the social unrest like you saw in other places. So before we go to the next slide, I just want to answer some questions that have come in. The answer is yes, these slides will be made available. You can just send me an email, and I'll be happy to. Also, there was a question, maybe somebody who came late, that what does move into storage mean? And that means effectively, if they've moved into storage, they're going into a Manhattan Mini storage unit, a public storage unit. That's to say they're leaving their belongings in New York City somewhere in a little storage unit. That's what that means, just going back. But let's keep moving along on these slides. So the demographics show that for people that moved within New York City, they moved largely to Brooklyn during the pandemic. You saw 1 out of 3 move to Manhattan. You also saw you've got a lot of people going into Brooklyn, the vast majority, 60%. And I think the question is, what's that demographic look like? And we don't have ages, we don't have incomes, but we do have what size apartments they move to. And this is specifically for Brooklyn. And Adam, I'm going to ask you about Manhattan as well, but let's just kind of slice up this chart. So these are people who, during the pandemic, moved from somewhere in New York City to Brooklyn. They may have been moving in Brooklyn to Brooklyn, Manhattan to Brooklyn, Queens to Brooklyn, but these are people who landed in Brooklyn. What size units did they largely land into? Tell us a little bit more about this chart.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway is 70% are studios and 1 bedrooms. and we talked about sort of the type of folks that we're seeing move to Brooklyn. And I think it is that young professional or a young couple in a studio or one bedroom, potentially looking for a little more space, but also looking, I think Brooklyn it's less dense than Manhattan. I think we've heard a lot of, Midtown Manhattan is a bit sleepy, nowadays with a lot of offices being closed. And so, still getting New York City life and vibes in Brooklyn, whereas, and this is reflected in the Manhattan data as well, even more so, families in bigger, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, 4 bedrooms, just aren't as represented in the data set. You asked me to speak to Manhattan, and I have it pulled up here. It's 93% of the moves with the destination of Manhattan were studios and 1 bedrooms. So we really didn't see much of the big unit sizes, which tend to be, a family. We didn't see those folks moving to Manhattan during this time frame, which again tends to be a smaller segment in Manhattan, just given types of units that are in the city, but much less so than we've seen in the past. So I think you've seen it across New York City generally, but I think it does speak to the type of people who are sticking around for now residentially. What it looks like when those storage moves come out of storage, we'll see. I think a larger percentage will be the bigger units, but we're seeing smaller units more represented here.
Very good. Interesting. So, yeah, my takeaway is that largely the people who stayed are that younger, kind of affluent demographic that goes into a studio or 1 bed. Maybe it's a couple, maybe it's a single person. There's probably a handful of very small families with this baby or something like that, but that, where you've seen, and this is intuitive when you look at the leasing market, where you've seen some softnesses in the share units and the bigger units, but a lot of people have found refuge in these studios and 1 bedrooms. Very interesting. So just kind of going to the takeaway slide, and I think the biggest question I know I have on my mind, and probably many people in the audience, is, so when are all these people going to come out of storage and start creating more demand? And I don't know that we have an answer to that question that's as scientific as we wish. But before we get your take on it, Adam, and I'm happy to hear from your perspective as the CEO of this moving company, what you think. I'm gonna launch a poll here and crowdsource. There's a saying that the wisdom of crowds usually knows. So I'm gonna launch a poll for the 70 or so people out there that have tuned in, and let's tell us when, from your perspective, when does your New York City office plan to reopen? And we're doing a live poll here. I don't know if we've gotten we're about halfway through everybody answering this. Adam, what do you think as people answer? What's your perspective of when people will come out of storage?
When people will come out of storage? So I think, and to be clear, this is not a data-driven answer. We don't know. Storage companies want to keep you there as long as possible, so they're by no means enforcing a time for you to get out. But I think still with uncertainty around when offices open, people are kind of asked to come back to the office. Local businesses and indoor dining, really opening up. Broadway, is another one. The election, unfortunately, is another big uncertain milestone that we have to get through. So I think kind of typically like a moving cycle we would see in another year, my guess is people are kind of settled for the rest of this year. And then, January being cold and the kind of start to the year, I wouldn't bet on that, but I do think towards the end of Q1 and definitely starting in Q2, we'll start to see more of a typical moving cycle with, and then you fast forward another 5 or 6 months, we will have a lot more clarity around, where the city's at, where a vaccine's at, what's happening politically, And with more certainty, people will start to make moves and settle down. So I think, towards the end of Q1 and definitely in Q2, we'll start to see a lot of that movement out of storage. But it's a guess.
All right. All right, fantastic. Well, you heard it here first. And before I close down the poll, we've got about 10 people that haven't voted. So if you haven't voted, we'd love to have the highest number participate. But just quick questions. For the pie chart, what is the corresponding timeline, start to finish? So the pie chart was January through now. So there were a few pre-COVID moves in there in the data set, but the vast majority was basically year to date is the answer. And then people are asking, does the moves to data just show moves from one borough to another or also within? I think the answer is both, right? You could be moving within Brooklyn to Brooklyn. You could be moving from New York City to Brooklyn. We just know that they landed in those destinations. 60% landed in Brooklyn. It's not to say that there was some massive, contingency of people that left Manhattan and went to Brooklyn, but you saw a lot of people either decide to go to Brooklyn or stay in Brooklyn. And then we've got another question. 62% of moves to storage. Does that mean the occupant is living in a storage unit? No, nobody moved into the storage unit. Or does that analysis does not know where they went to live? We do not know where they left to. It just means they left their belongings, their couch, their bed, anything they decided to keep. They're paying the Manhattan premium to leave it in Manhattan, probably because they plan to come back and get it out of storage. We don't know when they're going to get it out of storage, but now I will end the poll. We've gotten pretty much everybody participating and here are the results. I think you are able to see those. When does your office plan to reopen in a meaningful way? 39% said we are already open. So that's good. It may be a little skewed because we're probably from the real estate audience. But it looks like the vast majority, 23 plus 34%, so over half are saying sometime in Q1, Q2. So Adam, your sort of idea of sometime in kind of the early part of spring to the middle part of next year is kind of in line with the wisdom of the crowd. So thank you. So with respect to time, if anybody